So one of the furries you probably haven't ever heard about if you are under the age of 18 is Fritz the cat. Now I can guarantee you that your parents have probably heard of this movie that started off of a comic book adaptation, and I can guarantee they might have some mixed feelings about it. Fritz the cat was a very explicit movie. If you're under the age of 18, I wouldn't recommend that you watch it or Google it or try to find it until you're 18 because it probably is illegal. But Fritz the Cat was one of those crazy bonkers movies that came out and had a whole host of crazy representations that were racist, sexist, anti Semitic, bigoted, like you name it, it probably had it. It was one of those movies that came out to define a generation in a way that probably it should never have even tried to. It had all kinds of social issues tied in. It explored drug use. I don't think there was anything this left unturned. This was a crazy, crazy movie. I actually did some research and watched it a bit difficultly because it was really hard to watch. But if you ever have a friend that references Fritz the Cats as to why furries are bad, just do yourself a favor and, if you're of age, Google it. Because it put out there things that were a lot. It had scenes with orgies, it had scenes with smoking weed, it had scenes with Nazis, it had scenes with rape. I don't think they had a scene in there that didn't offend at least a few viewers. It was one of those movies that was edgy for the sake of being edgy because the cartoon was kind of edgy for the sake of being edgy for its time. There is some good writing in there. You do get a sense of the time period in which it was made, and you do get some really interesting cultural differences explored through animals, but in terms of the furry context, it's probably not going to do us much favors. So, Fritz the Cat. Yeah, Fritz the Cat is one of those controversial furries that probably most people won't tackle, but hey man, here I am tackling it. So let's go a little bit more into Fritz the Cat. So Fritz the Cat was basically an American adult-themed comedy made in 1972, which was written and directed by Ralph Bakshi. Bakshi? Not really sure. It was debuted loosely on the comic strips by Robert Crumb, and it was the first animated feature film to receive an X rating in the United States. In the marketing, they even called this out. We're not X-rated for nothing, baby. And God knows they were not. The film stars Fritz, who at the time was voiced by Skip Hinant, and he essentially was an anthropomorphic cat in 1960s New York, pretty much exploring everything that your mom tells you not to, such as hedonism, socio-political consciousness, drug use, sex. It was meant to be a satire focusing on college life in America, race relations, free love, and left and right-wing politics. So in theory, this was a really interesting movie. In execution, though, whoo boy. So the original comic had its merits as a pretty edgy comic, and unsurprisingly, it also stirred up a whole bunch of X-rated films after it that were animated, including a sequel, The 9 Lives of Fritz the Cat, which was made without Crumb or Bakshi's involvement, and probably for good reason. This movie explored a lot. It had literal Jim Crows. Literal Jim Crows. You thought that Disney Jim Crow representations were bad. These go beyond. But it was animated pretty well. For what it's worth, it was animated pretty well for its time. And it did have an interesting setup. You first see Fritz the Cat basically gathered with hippies in New York City, singing protest songs on guitar. And that then devolves into utter madness. They actually have policemen portrayed as pigs. Yep, that's a thing that they have. And there are a whole bunch of interesting random things that happen. Fritz gets chased to a synagogue. Um, Fritz goes to a bar in Harlem. Um, Fritz has a whole lot of things happen to him, and by the end of the movie, you're not really sure if you like Fritz or you hate Fritz. But you're definitely gonna have an impression left by Fritz by the end of the movie, let's just put it that way. I don't want to spoil the whole thing for you guys. Should you want to watch this, just be aware that it has everything from an older fox girlfriend to a heroin addicted rabbit biker, and a horse girlfriend, and a gang rape. So just gonna quickly mention that for anyone who is easily offended or maybe triggered by that, but there is a gang rape. So if that is a thing you don't want to see in movies, just don't watch it. But Fritz the Cat remains one of the most controversial things ever made in that time, and probably ever. So Fritz the Cat, everyone, most controversial furry in history. So this isn't necessarily one furry per se, but let's say the entire movie as it stands, Watership Down. If you were forced to read this as a kid in school, I'm sure you remember just how traumatizing this was. You basically saw cute little rabbits, sorry to anyone who has a rabbit persona or fursuit, who essentially are fighting for their home turf and experience a whole myriad of disturbing things happen to them. It's unreal how disturbing it is. And you follow this group of rabbits through their life as they negotiate all kinds of nonsense. Let's get into a little more detail there. So Watership Down is essentially a fantasy adventure novel, which was created by English author Richard Adams, also in 1972. I think we're seeing a trend here. It featured a small group of rabbits who live in their natural environment, but they are anthropomorphized, which is why they make this list. They possess their own culture, language, proverbs, poetry, even some mythology, and they do touch on themes from more epic tales that you are probably familiar with. Essentially, it follows the rabbits as they try to escape the destruction of their home and try to find a new place to call home, which brings a whole bunch of issues with it. It was the author's first novel, and not surprisingly, a whole bunch of publishers said hell no to this because it is extremely violent and extremely hard to read, and oh man, is it hard to watch. So Watership Down essentially refers to the destination they're trying to reach, called Watership Down, which is a hill in North Hampshire, England, which is actually pretty close to where the author grew up. The story kind of begins as, they're going on this journey, and it starts innocently enough. You start to really like the rabbits, you start to really feel for the rabbits, and then you get to see the disturbing society that is the rabbits. They have ultimate bosses in this. They have characters you really start to feel for. They have tragedy. There is hardship. There is love. There is all kinds of nonsense. Dogs are used in here as a pretty big metaphor and just as really mean characters. So anyone who has a dog persona, I'm sorry. And there's all kinds of really deep story building in here as well. I don't want to ruin this for you. If you've already read it, I feel like you've already kind of been ruined from this, but it's one of those really classic stories with anthropomorphized characters that was disturbing to all of us and sticks with a lot of people to this day, myself included. So yeah, Watership Down, one of the most terrifying, horrifying, and controversial furry representations in pop culture, in this instance books and film, to ever be discovered in society. Yeah. Now, lastly, because I want to make sure you actually get sleep tonight and are not having waking nightmares, the last one on this list is The Plague Dogs. The Plague Dogs follows the story of two dogs escaping utter horror and trying to make their way through life and survive in the conditions that they are given. And you do start to feel for the dogs. The animation style is very classic and will probably remind you of some of the things you grew up with, but in a way that'll really mess with your head. So let's just dive straight into Plague Dogs, shall we? So The Plague Dogs was a movie that came out in 1982 from a British director, I believe, and was based on a 1977 novel with the same name by Richard Adams. The film was essentially put together by Martin Rosen, who also did Watership Down, shocker, and, it was then adapted into another novel by Adams. God knows why. The film was rated PG-13 for heavy animal cruelty themes, violent imagery, and emotionally distressing scenes, much like Watership Down. It was a really hard movie to watch, and it centered around two dogs named Ralph and Snitter, who had to escape a research laboratory in Great Britain. You can only imagine what kinds of horrible research was being done there. And it pretty much highlighted the cruelty of performing vivisection, Google that if you will, and animal research. Now, the plot is a bit hard to follow. I had to watch it a couple times through, but Ralph and Snitter are one of many dogs used for experiments at the facility, and they have essentially had to watch many of their comrades die. And they kind of explore the facility to escape until they sneak into an incinerator where they are nearly killed before escaping. So we start with them almost dying. Great start. They move on from this. They meet a bunch of really crazy characters. There is a fox they meet named Todd. And they also meet a hunter who, I'm not going to ruin that. And essentially, throughout the film, the researchers are trying to find them, and they are trying to escape. And I will just say this so that you are not ruined for life. The ending is a little up for interpretation, but the overwhelming consensus is that it is depressingly sad, so just have a lot of tissues on hand. Now, the imagery in this is about on par with Watership Down. You are going to be genuinely horrified throughout. So if you're under the age of 18 or easily distressed by horrifying imagery, maybe skip this one for a bit. Or if you just want to have a good day, don't watch it at all. Unless, you're having a rough day and want to make it worse. It's a good movie, I'll give it that. It does have its merits, but it is horrifying, much like all of the things on this list. But, yeah, this was pretty controversial, especially for all of the abuse shown in this. This is probably one of the most controversial movies made with anthropomorphized characters. While they don't look anthropomorphic, they are certainly anthropomorphic in the way they are portrayed. Some of the characters talk. And you do get very, very bonded to these two dogs as you watch the movie, which is why I'm just going to tell you right now, if you're the kind of person that's upset by dogs getting hurt, this is really not the movie for you to watch. But it does qualify them as one of the most controversial furry portrayals of all time. Yeah. So, yeah, those are the most controversial furry movies of all time. Oh, those were hard to watch. If you've ever seen any of those, it's a lot. But it's good to know where some of this history comes from, because it does lend to understanding where some of those stereotypes come from. Obviously, a lot of these are old enough that they probably don't perpetuate that much of the furry hate we're seeing today, but they certainly don't help. So, I hope this is informative and interesting. I spent probably like 4.5 hours to 5 hours editing this and getting all the research. So, at any rate, guys, have a great rest of your week and have a great day. All right, bye!
You have some doubt showing your faces. It had been so so long, I thought you disappeared. Why did you pretend I was still so close when it's all too